Editors Canada welcomes you to Iva Cheung and Laura Edlund's webinar, Introducing Accessibility Standards Canada Standard for Plain Language. The session will last approximately an hour, including time for questions. Before we begin, Editors Canada respectfully acknowledges that we are on and work on the traditional lands of the Indigenous peoples, Inuit, First Nations, Métis, in what we now call Canada. We honor the ancestry, heritage, and gifts of the Indigenous peoples and give thanks to them. And now welcome. I am Carol Wells, your volunteer host with Editors Canada for today's webinar, and I'd like to introduce the presenters of today's session. Iva Cheung is a certified professional editor, cookbook indexer, publishing consultant, and mental health researcher. She is a winner of the Tom Fairley Award for Editorial Excellence, President's Award for Volunteer Service, and Karen Virag Award for promoting the editing profession. A longtime plain language advocate and scholar, she joined ASC's Plain Language Technical Committee in 2020 as an academic member. She is grateful to live on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Helkomelem-speaking peoples, including the Kakite First Nation. Laura Edlund is a certified structural editor, certified stylistic editor, writer, and consultant for hire. She specializes in education, plain language, and stories, and is working on contract at UHN. She joined ASC's Plain Language Technical Committee in 2020 as a business and industry member. She is grateful to live in Toronto, which is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. Welcome, Iva and Laura.
Thank you so much, Carol. Thank you everyone for taking the time to join us today. As Carol mentioned, my name is Iva. My pronouns are she and her. I'm joining from the unceded territory of the Halkomelem speaking peoples, including the Kakite First Nation, the place also known as New Westminster, British Columbia. To give you a visual description, I am a woman of Chinese ancestry. I'm wearing a burgundy and black striped top, as well as a headset and glasses. I have to apologize today. I am still fighting a very persistent respiratory virus. And so my voice sounds pretty mangled today. And I'm going to try not to have a coughing fit as I present. But if I do, I promise I will mute myself. So thank you so much for your patience. I'll throw it over to Laura to do an accessibility statement and visual description.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. I'm Laura Edlund. I'm she and her, and I'm here in Toronto. For a visual description, I am a woman who is wearing glasses with blue frames. I'm white and I have gray hair. Maybe it was a standard. Um, and I'm looking forward to this presentation and to hearing your feedback. Thank you very much for having us, Editors Canada and Carol Wells. And I'm looking forward to presenting with you, Iva.
Thanks, Laura. We can go to the next slide.
Okay.
Just a quick disclaimer that Laura and I are both members of Editors Canada. We're also both members of Plain Language Association International, and of course, the members of the technical committee that developed the standard that we're going to talk about, but we are not representing those organizations. That said, Accessibility Standards Canada did provide us with a few slides that we're going to present soon. And if you attended the session that Laura and I did for the 2022 virtual conference, then you'll notice that a lot has changed since those early days of standard development. Right? Throw it over to you, Laura.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to give a bit of an overview. We will be reading some text aloud to enhance accessibility, and we will be sending out the slides as mentioned before. And first of all, here's an overview. We will give the background about ASC, the Plain Language Standard Technical Committee, the standard itself, timelines, challenges, process, choices, outcomes, etc., the standard, its organization, some of the content, and some examples. We will try to touch on context for editors, writers, and allied work, and then we will try to have a question period of about 10 minutes at the end. Of course, we also welcome follow-up questions. And as mentioned in the webinar description, this is an introduction. In future talks and workshops, there will be opportunities for more information, more discussion, and hands-on work with the standard. Thank you.
Thanks, Laura. Okay, so as mentioned, we are not representing Accessibility Standards Canada, but the organization did ask us to present a few slides to give context for the organization and their standards development process. So Accessibility Standards Canada was established in 2019 under the Accessible Canada Act, and its goals are to identify, remove, and prevent barriers with the aim of creating a barrier-free Canada by 2040. So it mainly tries to accomplish these goals through three things. One, to develop accessibility standards. Two, to advance accessibility research. And three, to share accessibility information. Okay, we can go to the next slide. So the standards that exist, there are about 6 published standards, and the rest of them are at various stages of development, about 35 in different stages of development. There are 5 technical guides and over 100 research projects. So 45 have been completed and 57 are underway. All of this information, so that includes all of the standards as well as the research, are accessible free of charge. And they're organized by Accessible Canada Act's 7 priority areas, which include employment, built environment, information and communication technologies, communication, procurement of goods, services, and facilities, design and delivery of programs and services, and transportation. Okay, next slide. So the standards development process is meant to be inclusive by design. So they use the principle of nothing without us. So this is at every stage of the development process. It includes people with disabilities. So more than half of the people on the board at Accessibility Standards Canada identify as disabled. There are, I think 26% of the staff are identified as disabled, and a majority of people on the technical committees have a disability. And so the standards are meant to apply to the Government of Canada, as well as federally regulated entities. So this includes industries like banking, air transportation, and telecommunications. They are meant to align with Canadian and international codes, laws, and regulations. And according to the Accessible Canada Act, they apply to English, French, ASL, LSQ, as well as Indigenous sign languages. Okay.
Next.
The standards are, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
It's okay.
Beg your pardon.
After the standards are created by the technical committees, they are sent out for public review. So they solicit feedback from the public for several months, and all of this feedback is considered when the technical committee prepares the final standard. And as we'll discuss later on, all standards are reviewed at least every 5 years. Okay, thank you. Next slide. So, excuse me. When the plain language standard was published, Dino Zupa, the Chief Executive Officer of Accessibility Standards Canada, issued this statement. He said that plain language is more than good writing. It's a matter of accessibility and inclusion. It helps people make informed decisions, access services, and participate fully in their communities. This new standard gives organizations the tools to remove barriers and ensure their information truly serves everyone. Right. Next, please. So this is a list of some of the people who are on our technical committee. I'm not going to read out everybody's names, but this slide shows the people who were representing consumer and public interest and the academic and research bodies. And the next slide shows the members of the technical committee that represent non-governmental organizations, business and industry, and government bodies. So the technical committee consisted of 18 people, many people identified as having disabilities or represent disability organizations. And many of the people on the technical committee worked in plain language, in accessibility, or both. Over to you, Laura.
Thank you. Okay, so let's look at the standard, the timeline, the process, and some challenges. As Iva mentioned, the government began researching accessibility in 2016. 2016 to 19, there were public consultations during which people with disabilities mentioned that told the federal government that plain language is vital to better understand information and to make informed decisions in their daily lives. Thus, that became the focus for the first standard. In 2020, ASC invited experts to form the Plain Language Technical Committee. And so we met from 2021 to 2023 as a group and developed and voted on the draft that became the public review. At around this time, in June 2023, the International Organization for Standardization, or ISO, released the ISO 24495-1, which is the Plain Language Part 1 Governing Principles and Guidelines. By this time, ASC was well into its process of developing its ASC Plain Language Standard. From May to July 2024, the public review draft was out for comments, and then public review comments came back from federally regulated entities, unions, municipalities, advocacy groups, people with lived experience, plain language experts in Canada, and from around the world. And we thank you very much. We will get into that later on. From November 2024 to May of 2025, a 6-member subcommittee of the technical committee met to analyze and address all 622 comments. We revised the standard based on those comments to make sure that every comment was addressed in some way. We then met with the whole committee, technical committee, to vote on the standard as revised, and then had further comments to address, 142 comments from the technical committee at large. And then we revised that standard. And sorry, I should have included that one. And then in June, we voted on the standard to publish the standard. Over the course of the summer, Standards Council of Canada, which is SCC, approved the standard. The standard was translated to French. It was not a straight translation, but that's another thing. There are parts of the standard that apply to English only, and there are parts that apply in French only. It was formatted for accessibility, and then a plain language summary was created in English and then translated into French, and it was also presented in ASL and LSQ. And it was then released October 13th, 2025 for International Plain Language Day. So along the way, we had various challenges, not least of which was we wanted to write a plain language standard that was accessible and written in plain language. However, we were required to follow Standard Council of Canada style guides that would allow for the standard to be legislation ready, so it could become regulation under the Accessible Canada Act. That was something that we wanted. So we had to indicate what was normative, as in required, what was recommended, and what were options. At the same time, the technical committee members were unfamiliar with the SCC standards writing style. And so we went through many, many meetings and discussion and revisions. We also had tight timelines. ASC would have liked us to have completed the standard in 2022. but trying to get as much plain language as possible and dealing with the writing style for SEC took a lot of time and discussion and revisions. We never met together in person, and we also drafted solely in English, which was a challenge for the technical committee. The public review, which was in May to July of 2024, received many, many comments in English and French. There were 70 commenters, over 622 comments. There were different organizations that were represented. There were individuals with various lived experience, expertise, and affiliations. It was quite a wide range, and we're very thankful for the comments that we received. That is a valuable and absolutely necessary part of the process. The overview of the comments, I'll just give you a bit of a heads up. The comments range from changes to single words to changes to punctuation to questions about terminology to concerns about the foundational definition of plain language or the scope or how it should be applied or where and how the organization of the document, the specific guidance, examples, and a lot. It was a lot. Very, very valuable. Here are some common comments. The draft standard was not in plain language, and we agree. We had some difficulties with the regulatory language, and it was harder than we would have liked. One comment was that it sounded like it had been written by AI or using AI. Another comment was that it lacked information on how to apply the standard. There was another comment, or there were many comments that it lacked an evaluation section. Another comment was that there was nothing about disabilities. Indeed, there had been many iterations of the draft that before the public review that included tips, examples, and cautions, that gave examples, that had an evaluation section, and there was guidance to do with specific disability communities. These were removed from the draft that went out for public review because they did not conform with the SEC writing style. We are extremely grateful for the comments that were gathered in the public review stage because they allowed us to revisit the content that had been removed. We heard, additionally, that it was too long and repetitive. And that was partly because I think we hadn't stitched together the parts from the different task groups well, and the organization was perhaps problematic, but we have addressed that. We also dealt with tight timelines. Another comment that we heard was, why not use the ISO standard? That's the plain language part 1. As we mentioned, the ASC process of developing a plain language standard for accessibility in Canada was well underway by the time the ISO standard was published. Additionally, they have a different scope and mandate, the two documents. And then we also heard comments regarding the organization of the standard and its definition for plain language. I'll turn to that in the next slide. So we made some key choices in response to the public review comments. One key decision was to make the mandate and the focus on disabilities, inclusion, and addressing barriers very clear and more obvious. For some public draft reviewers, this had not been clear. So the standard now focuses on that mandate and makes it absolutely obvious that we need to address barriers that people might face when trying to address or trying to access and understand information or communication rather than focusing on specific disabilities. We decided to focus on the barriers. And the barriers can appear in different ways and can combine. And the Accessible Canada Act defines barriers, it defines disabilities, and we looked at how we could do this. We decided to focus on 6 categories of barriers, as I said, not specific disabilities. And these are explained in section 7.3 of the standard. In the interest of time, I'm not going to dwell on the specifics here, but I will show them to you. Please see 7.3 for them. I'll give an example, however. Language and comprehension barriers are related to unfamiliar language and the way information is presented, making the information hard or impossible to understand. Emotional or distress-related barriers could be those related to cognitive overload, stress, or attention-related challenges. Visual and hearing barriers barriers caused by text, visuals, or audios without alternate formats. And you can read more about them, as I said, in section 7.3, and there are examples which we'll touch on later. Other choices we made were regarding the length and the repetition in the organization. As we said, people complained about the length of the standard and the repetition within it. Once again, we had wanted to have the standard with requirements, but also illustrate how you could comply with requirements. We wanted to present possible strategies, notes, cautions, give examples from actual subjects that people who would use this standard would find in their work life. And we wanted to have those as close as possible to the standards, to the clauses of the standard. We wanted to do this so that they didn't have to look to a separate guidance document or to an appendix at the back. We wanted it to be easy to use, and we knew that if we organized it correctly and with a hyperlinked table of contents and improved headings, that we could achieve that. The result is a longer standard, but we also believe that it is more useful. We wanted to reduce repetition, but remain conscious that there was some repetition that was warranted. For example, we dwell on the word audience and an intended audience because that really matters. We did reinstate or put in a new evaluation section. We address the ISO 24495-1, the governing principles and guidelines. It's addressed in the preface, which is section 5, and again in the scope, and particularly 7.3 notes 1 to 4. In sum, basically, the two different plain language standards, I'll just refer to them in brief. ISO is an international standard. It's focused on plain language for a general audience. It does not address easy language. And additionally, this is behind a paywall. In contrast, the ASC Plain Language Standard has a mandate focused on Canada and intentionally addressing a wider audience, including people with disabilities. So they're very different. At the same time, the standards are not in competition with each other. They each have their own purpose. Each one is different in its context and its focus and its mandate. Each is in a collection of other standards that are being published now or are in development. And together, the many standards, codes, and guidelines will help address plain language and acquaint people with plain language practices and ultimately benefit people around the world who will benefit from plain language in clear and actionable language for information and to make their decisions. Sorry, I think I need some water too. Okay, so we had some successes and challenges. I've put these all together because they are very much of a group. We had some successes in writing plain language and increasing the plain language. We had continued challenges with that. We wanted before and after the public review to change the shall, should, and may statements to something that was plainer. We were not given that opportunity. We asked both before and after the public review document draft stage, and we were not allowed to, but perhaps that will change as requirements for legal language change, perhaps in response to ISO 24495-2. We did, however, have the success of being able to change the language from the organization shall to saying you shall. So that was a success. We did succeed in adding more plain language as we added examples in English and French to address situations in Canada that could benefit from plain language. We added more possible strategies to follow the standard. We were able to know add notes and cautions, and we added a final list of all the shall, should, and may statements to make it easier for reference. We also included the summary in plain language, and we improved the navigation. We did have the challenge of needing to retain the front matter, which is sections 1 through 5. That's a rather lengthy section from Accessibility Standards Canada, and it's required in all of the standards. We would have liked that to be in plain language. We would have liked it to possibly go to another document or appear at the end, but that was not allowed for. We had problems with the formatting of the standard. We were not in charge of that. And we also had difficulties with the translation being true to the intent. However, we had successes and challenges, shall we say. Anyway, so what's in the standard? First off, we have a definition that we settled on, which is a communication is in plain language if its wording, structure, and design are so clear that the intended audience can easily do each of the following: find what they need, understand what they find, and use that information. We looked at the definitions from PLAIN, which is the Plain Language Association International, the International Plain Language Federation website, and the ISO standard once it was published. We had settled on using the wording given in the Plain Language Plain Association website, which uses the word audience, and I've highlighted it there for your reference. This differs from the IPLF and the ISO draft, which uses reader. We decided that audience was more inclusive than reader. We acknowledge that the ISO standard clarifies that reader can be used broadly, but we prefer to use audience in our own document. We also made some additional decisions. We decided to put the phrases find what they need, understand what they find, and use that information in a bullet list. And we decided to provide a stem before that, the do each of the following, which you see with the insertion points. So we use that definition as a basis for the reorganization. The audience comes first. The audience is first as the audience comes first in plain language and is the center of plain language. We place the evaluation next, and we'll talk about that later. We place structure next, and then wording and expression, and I'll address that later. And then finally design, and that's the organization. The introduction is section 6, and it describes the goals of the standard to make sure that communication is relevant, findable, understandable, and usable for the intended audience. This is about the focus of plain language, which is first and always on the intended audience, and how developing plain language is a process. This section identifies the benefits of plain language for both the intended audience and for the organizations that use plain language. It describes contexts in which plain language is essential, and you can read about those in section 6. And it identifies the guiding principles behind the standard, including, for example, the right to accurate information. The scope section is section 7, and this is critical. This standard applies to communications of information. It applies to various formats. It applies to external audiences, but could also be of relevance to internal audiences. It applies to the official languages in Canada and sign languages, as Iva noted earlier, and it could apply to additional languages. It could benefit many organizations and audiences, but specifically it is intended for those governed by federal law. So government agencies, bodies in the government of Canada, industries, companies, and organizations governed by federal laws. We address those people, those organizations, and the people who are working on their behalf as you. Section 7.3 has some keynotes about the standard, how it's broad, it's in its application, and focused on the Canadian content. Section 7.4 addresses the adoption of the standard, which is at present voluntary, and it can be adopted in whole or part. Section 8 deals with references. Basically, normative references are, if you choose to adopt this standard, you must then follow these other standards. A normative standard is one that you must follow if you choose to adopt this standard. An informative reference is one that is for your information. The first example in the normative list is the ICT, or Information Communication Technology, standard from ASC. The second one is in draft. This list would change based on the availability of standards over time because ASC is creating more standards. The informative one is the ISO 24495. That is informative because, well, it's very, very incredibly useful, but it's not available to everybody, and it also has a different mandate. So the lists of normative and informative standards would change over time because different standards are being created over time. The definitions section includes definitions of key terms as used in the standard. Some of them are, the terms are used in specific ways. For example, we say intended audience rather than reader, as mentioned before. We use the term communication instead of, for example, document, because we're referring to the key definition of plain language, that communication is in plain language, etc., etc. So the section is very useful, and I hope you look at it. And on that note, over to you, Iva.
Thanks, Laura. So what Laura kind of covered up until this point, you could really say is sort of the front matter of the standard, and where you get into the actual clauses, the shall, should, and may clauses, is the audience section. And this was like our first kind of meaty section of the standard. And we focus on the audience because it is central to the definition of plain language. Plain language can be plain to one audience, but not to another. And it's critical to learn about your audience and know what kind of information needs they have and how to meet them. So this section, it focuses on identifying and learning from the intended audience, engaging your audience so that you can find out what barriers they face, how they prefer to be identified, their information needs and considerations, what they already know, what they still need to know, the languages and formats they need. And it also addresses how to engage with the intended audience before, during, and after the creation of the communication. We heard from some public reviewers during the review portion of the development of the standard that engaging audiences would be onerous or even impossible. So what we did in response was we offered strategies for how to learn about the audience, how to engage them, examples of what you can learn from your intended audience, and ways to learn about the intended audience when engagement is not possible. Next slide, please. So just to cover some examples from that section, this one says identifying the intended audience to develop a communication in plain language. You shall do each of the following. Identify the intended audience for the communication. Identify if the intended audience consists of a primary audience and one or more secondary audiences. And if there's more than one audience, identify if an audience needs a separate communication. And so this was a very deliberate choice on our part to emphasize the fact that there is a primary audience for your communication, and there may be one or more secondary audiences. And this is because a chief complaint of many people within the disability community is that often communications, people will communicate not to them, but to their family care partners, for example. And we really wanted to emphasize that when you're creating communications for people with disabilities, you should communicate with them. They are your primary audience. And their family care partners might be a secondary audience, and you should consider them when you're creating communications, but do speak to that primary audience of people with disabilities. Okay, thanks. Next slide, please. A couple more examples. I'll just read the first one, learning about your intended audience, because it covers when those very rare situations when you actually can't do any kind of engagement before you create your communication. So it says, learning about your intended audience, throughout the development of your communication, you shall consult and engage with the intended audience about their information needs and any barriers they face. except where consultation and engagement are not possible in some cases, for example, in emergencies. And the next section of the standard deals with evaluation, and we sort of close the loop on that. So even if you can't engage with your audiences, these are some strategies that you can use to create meaningful communications. And then you have to make sure in the evaluation section, next slide, please, that you do bring that back and maybe evaluate on an ongoing basis. Okay, so evaluation section, we place this directly after the audience section to emphasize that evaluation happens throughout the communication development process, right? So some people expect evaluation to come at the end, but we wanted really to emphasize that you should do this throughout. We use the word evaluation in a broad sense, whereas user testing is very specific. So evaluation includes desktop review, review by a subject matter expert, review by a plain language expert, as well as specifically user testing. And user testing is the only part of this section that we require. So it is a shall section that uses shall statements. The rest of them are sort of optional. And with the desktop review, these include, for example, running your communication through a screen reader before you publish it to make sure that it's accessible to people who use screen readers, running it through software that the color blindness simulator software. So you make sure that your visuals are accessible to people who might not be able to distinguish certain colors, for example. Key to this desktop review section is that we say using readability metrics like the Flesch-Kincaid readability checkers do not meet the standard. So that's one thing that we wanted to emphasize. We also, in this section, again, talk about ongoing evaluation, and we can cover that in the next couple slides. So next slide, please. Some examples from this section: testing. As you develop your communication and before you publish it, you shall test your communication with members of your intended audience, and you shall recruit testers who reflect the diversity of your intended audience, right? So these are the only required clauses in evaluation, but we feel that if you don't test with your intended audience, you cannot say that your communication is in plain language. You must ask them and get that feedback before you can actually say that it's in plain language. This is an outcomes-based metric. Okay, thanks. Next slide. And also another example clause from this section is on ongoing evaluation. You should continue to evaluate your communication regularly after publication for the following reasons: to determine if communications continue to meet audience needs, to evaluate any communications that could not be evaluated before publication, and to learn how audiences are using communications. So that second point in that list closes the loop on that very specific situation where you have to issue, let's say, emergency communications where you don't have time to engage with your audience beforehand. Okay, thanks.
Hi, thank you. So structure is the section next, and this is to help the intended audiences get, find, and navigate the information they need. And some people might find it unusual that structure is addressed here, but structure is a key aspect of plain language. Some people will be thinking that plain language is focusing on the words only, but this section clarifies how structure can help a communication, how it is organized, the format it takes, what information is included, how it is ordered, how the parts are related, and structural elements such as the titles, the headings, the overview, perhaps an index, the background and supplementary material, those are included in this section. This section is going from the questions about what the audience needs and is familiar with, and then gets more granular. So I'll show you some examples. You shall develop the structure of a communication using these strategies. Learn what structures and formats are accessible to the intended audience, familiar to them, and preferred by them. Plan the structure to help the intended audience find information in the communication, and evaluate the structure of the communication with the intended audience and revise based on that evaluation. That's one of the clauses. There are also clauses to do with planning the information in parts, organizing the information to do with priority, using things like headings and lists and various other structural elements that can help people find their way through a document or through any other communication sort. I'm going to move on to wording and expression. This is the next section. And this is probably the largest single portion of the standard and the one that is typically associated with plain language and clear communications. To this section title, we added expression because we address not only words, but numbers and sign language as ways to achieve plain language. This section is about the elements of writing, the words you choose, when and how you define words if you must, using abbreviations carefully and only as needed, using numbers, for example, and dates, constructing sentences, titles and headings, using your punctuation, creating lists with care, and so on. It also addresses the writing style and tone, and it addresses unique attributes of English and French writing. For example, we address conjunctions, capitalization, various things that are specific to English. We address the singular they pronoun, pardon me. We address epicene writing, which is specific to French. And we also address things like paragraph and sections. So here are some examples. You shall choose clear and precise words that that the intended audience already knows, understands, uses, and accepts. You shall help your intended audience, learn words that are unfamiliar to them, uncommon words, or specialized words. And I'd like to point out that in the actual standard, there are examples given for words that would be needed, but would need to be defined or explained in some way to an audience for them to be able to do what they need to do. So the standard is not saying make everything simple so that everything is in familiar language. Sometimes that's not possible for a task at hand. It is, however, necessary that you explain a key term if someone is to be acting upon it and making decisions about their own life. We also address numbers. We address titles and headings. A common problem is words and expressions that are not easily understood or are not transparent in what they mean or don't accurately reflect the material that follows. So we address that in the standard. We also address the writing style and tone. This is something, to do with formality or inclusiveness or identity, but at the same time, the language needs to be clear for the intended audience. So there's a balancing act always. So that's why we include the caution. As ever, evaluating with the intended audience is really important. And over to you, Iva.
Thanks, Laura. So the next big section in the standard is on design. There was some debate in earlier drafts about whether design should be part of the standard, and the technical committee landed firmly on yes, absolutely, because wording, structure, and design are integral parts of the definition of plain language. We also heard from public comments that we should add more guidance about effective document design, images, alt text, etc. And so we did include a section on design that focused on these overall presentation format, layout, typography, contrast and colors, visuals, and tables. But we aimed to give general guidance that would benefit both professional designers and people doing design, doing desktop publishing, essentially desktop design. That said, not all professional designers are well versed in plain language design principles. So we felt that this section would help them understand those principles as well. Okay, so some examples. Next slide, please. Format, you shall choose the format that best meets the needs and preferences of your intended audience. So you can see that it's very general, but it always brings it back to the audience, right? So we always have to make sure that our intended audience is benefiting from whatever we choose, whether it's format, layout, or typography. So an example here for typography, you shall choose a typeface and font size that your intended audience can easily read from a comfortable distance within the context of the situation. And we chose to be this general because we understood that when the standards being applied for, federally regulated entities, we're not just looking at documents that people are going to be reading on 8.5 by 11 paper in front of them. But we have to take into account highway signs. We have to take into account labels on prescription bottles, those kinds of things. And so we can't really prescribe, typefaces, specific typefaces or specific type sizes. We can't say, type must be at least 16-point font or something like that. That is much too specific. We wanted to stay general, but you can see that with the the general guidance that we're giving, we're also always bringing it back to the intended audience and ensuring that people test with their intended audience to make sure that these design choices are effective communication. Okay, thanks. Next slide. Another example from the design section, visuals. When using visuals, you shall use them to support the intended audience's understanding of the information in your communication. You shall use a type and style of visuals that is accepted by your intended audience and appropriate for the purpose. Okay, so next slide, please. As we mentioned, we chose to address barriers as opposed to specific disability. Excuse me. And when we talk about barriers, there are sometimes very specific choices that we suggest that people make if they're creating communications for a specific population that experiences a lot of these barriers. So some examples from addressing barriers from the structure section, the first one, to address language and comprehension barriers when using headings, you shall limit heading levels to at most 3 levels. Okay, from the paragraph section, we say to address information access and navigation barriers when constructing paragraphs or sections, you should use icons or visuals to help guide the intended audience. So you see there that's a should, that's just a suggestion. And then finally, to address memory, attention, and processing barriers when using vertical lists, you should do the following: express list items as complete sentences and limit lists to at most 5 items. So this is specific to people with memory, attention, and processing barriers. So if you look at sort of general plain language guidance, they'll say, bulleted lists are often very effective. But for these particular barriers, people facing these particular barriers, a list that is just a sentence fragment can be extremely confusing because they might not have the working memory capacity to hold the stem of that list in their working memory. And so by the time they're looking at the list of sentence fragments, they've sort of forgotten what the list is actually about. And then the list just looks like, a disjointed list of items that don't really have a cohesive meaning. And so to address those barriers, those lists should be in complete sentences. So this is just an example of how we're addressing specific barriers. Okay, next slide, please. Annexes. Excuse me. So these are at the very end of the standard. There's a forms checklist and a legal notice and bibliography, but what I wanted to draw your attention to is Annex B, which is the shall, should, and may clauses. As Laura mentioned, we chose to make the document itself, or the standard itself, comprehensive in that we give people the clause of what they shall, should, or may do, and then we add context to help them do that. So strategies, examples, notes, and cautions. So some people will find that helpful if they're trying to implement those clauses, but other people might just want a straight checklist of things that they have to do to meet the standard, in which case they can look at Annex B, and those clauses are all pulled out and organized by shall, should, and may, so people know exactly what they need to do to meet the standard. Okay, next slide. Okay, so just wanted to mention that we want the standard is meant to be a living document. So this document, or the standard, as we mentioned, will be reviewed and updated, excuse me, will be reviewed and updated every 5 years or earlier if needed. So this standard has in the spirit of plain language, the standard has gone through multiple types of user testing. So there was the public review process. And then after that, the technical committee also submitted comments, and there was a review process for that before it was published. And now that it is published, there's an opportunity to do essentially user testing in situ, right? So people who are actually applying the standard, we understand that things will change. They might run into problems. And so if you find yourself using the standard and you have suggestions for how it can be improved, every page of the standard has this little button on the bottom that says report a problem on this page. If you click on that button, the window to the right will pop up. That will allow you to submit comments on how you would suggest changing the standard. And that will be taken into account in the next sort of 5-year review. Okay. Finally, next.
Okay. So for the landscape for editors and others, there are many, many resources available. So I put on the right-hand side some of the things that are available, the Accessible Canada Act, of course, the different standards from Accessibility Standards Canada, and their resources, the various provincial acts, such as Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act and Statistics Canada, as part of getting to know your audience. And of course, the suggestions for how to do that in the audience section. For editors and writers and others who are involved in this work, Simon Fraser University's Plain Language Courses and Certificate, Martin Cutt's Oxford Guide to Plain Language, the Editors Canada Professional Editorial Standards Update from 2024 is really, really useful. The ISO standards, of course, are wonderful. If you access them, there's a plain language standard out, as you know, 24495-1. There is a new one, the legal communications for associations to belong to and learn from and see events from Plain Language Association International and the International Plain Language Federation, Plain Canada Clare, Editors Canada, and others. Of course, you can learn from Web ContentAccessibility Guidelines and other ICT standards. There's also a brilliant website called WCAG in Plain Language from Aardvark Communications, I believe it is. However, all of this means that there has been a shift. For plain language, some people will be working on materials where they do a whole lot of engagement. They are very centered on their audience. They have a process that involves multiple reviews and inclusion and engagement in a process of developing or co-creating to have a circular process of evaluation and recreation and review and update and so on and so forth. For some people who are more used to a linear process of a writer writes something and editor edits it, and there are perhaps multiple stages of editing, and then it is designed, and then it is proofread, and then there is no feedback and there is no update. This might feel like quite a bit of a shift. So there are many opportunities for teamwork and collaboration, engagement and research, cultural humility, and lifelong learning and training. We would love to hear from you about your response. And plain language requires a focus on the audience and the traditional roles of publishing that some of you might be familiar with might feel like it might feel odd to have this focus on the audience and perhaps a co-creation. But we look forward to, working with you and hearing about your responses. So as I've said, it's focusing on the audience needs. If you work closely with subject matter experts and designers and community advisory councils and user testing specialists, you and they will be learning so much from your audiences. Thank you very much. And on that note, Iva.
Yeah, just to close us out, you'll see QR codes on the slide that'll take you to the English and French versions of the standard. And I've also posted those links in the chat. Okay, I think that's it for me.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Iva and Laura. Thank you, Eva, for pointing out. We did have a question about whether there was a downloadable or printable version of the standards, and I would refer everyone to the chat where Iva's placed a link. She sent a message that is addressed to everyone, so you should be able to find it in the chat window that has links to the Accessibility Association and the French and English standard. We do have just a couple of questions. The first one asks, is there a quick reference type user guide somewhere we can find tips and practical examples, or can there be one in the future, please?
I can address that. There is the checklist or the summary of shall, should, and may statements. There are also examples throughout. I would strongly urge anybody who is wanting to use the standard to start from the audience section and then work forward into the rest of the standard, because the audience is always the focus. If you feel that you have a lot of knowledge about, say, wordsmithing and focusing on the words, less about design, start with the audience first, go with the evaluation, and then move from there. If you want to see how many examples there are, look for the word note, and you will find examples throughout the whole document. It is long, but you will find that the whole table of contents is clickable, and the headings are very easy to use, and you will be able to find sections. We look forward to your feedback, though, and I'm not anticipating that we'll be doing an immediate update with a how-to guide, but we'll wait and see. Iva, do you have comments on that? Any more
Okay.
questions?
The next, one more question. One person mentioned they don't see the link in the chat, but Iva has just reposted them. So to our attendees, please try take another look and see if you can see it there. It is showing up for me in the chat, so maybe refresh your settings or look around in other parts of the window just to make sure if you've missed it. Another question is asked, I missed why you had to use the word shall in the document. Could you explain it again? And the question goes on to comment on this person's experience of fighting not to use the word shall. But first, I'll just ask if you can repeat your explanation.
Yes, so we agree. The whole committee wanted shall removed from the standard, but we are required by the SCC, so the Standards Council of Canada, to use the words shall, should, may, and could, right? So those are what we have to use to make the standard legislation ready. Now, this might change in the future if Standards Council of Canada gets enough feedback from people that we should be using must, for example. That, if they hear from enough people, and if we're able to sort of use this standard to kind of reinforce how they communicate their standards, then hopefully at some point this can change. But this is what we're stuck with now, and we do define shall in the standard to say it's essentially must, right? This is a requirement. So yes, this is a concession that we had to make because of SEC requirement.
So it's in the 7.5, the terminology section within the scope. SCC is the organization, and we would love to hear more feedback about that. The other thing is that the ISO 24495-2, to do with plain language and legal communication, I hope will help many people who are involved with legal documents push for clarity of expression in legal documents. And so that kind of response from you, and the feedback that ASC will receive, and the support of ISO documents, and a tidal wave of legislators who would like to have plain language would very much help this effort to have plain language in documents like this.
Before we move on to the next questions, I just want to throw out a question to the group. because Laura and I and possibly other members of the Plain Language Technical Committee have submitted a proposal to follow up on this particular presentation at the 2026 conference in Halifax. And we'd like some feedback from you about where, what the next steps of learning might be for you, what would be useful for you to hear if you were to attend that session at the conference. So feel free to pop that into the chat. All right, so I guess there's a question here. From a government standpoint, how is compliance with the standard regulated or enforced? That's a really great question. So right now, the standard is published and it is voluntary. So people can use it in part or in full. However, if this standard is adopted into regulation, then it will become it will become required for the government of Canada and federally regulated entities. So right now, we know that it has been recommended for adoption to the minister, but we don't know how long that process will take, or really, when they would agree to adopt it into regulation, because they probably have different priorities. The ministry that is responsible for the standard has changed because Mark Carney's government eliminated the ministry that was specifically responsible for accessibility and has now folded it into the Ministry of Jobs and Families, I believe. And so because of those changes, there might be a delay in how in when this standard will actually be adopted into regulation. Now, when it is adopted into regulation, it is enforced primarily through a complaints process. So there's the Commissioner of Accessibility who will take in comments. So if you notice something that isn't compliant, you can submit a complaint to the Commissioner, and they will launch an investigation and issue remedies as needed. Anything to add, Laura?
No, except that the Accessible Canada Act did receive support from all parties when it was voted into law or passed into law. So let's focus on that. And the other thing is that having clear, accessible, trustworthy information is vital for so many businesses, organizations, and for the public service. So I would think that a lot of people would consider that a priority. We look forward to hearing from you about this and about this document, working through it. I've been using it since it was released and the advice before, and I'm finding it incredibly useful. And we hope that you do too.
I see one more question that was entered into the chat for host and panelists as opposed to the Q&A. So I'll just read it out. Melanie says, no doubt focusing on the audience's needs and has always been important. However, here's my question. How far does plain language standards how will go before the quality and richness of the language is lost? What can be done in the English language, for example, may not apply to the French language without making that language sound as baby language. So I'll just say that the plain language standard is meant for informational documents, not necessarily for like literary works, right? So in terms of the richness of language, there are still many opportunities outside of strictly informational documents or informational communications to develop the richness of language. In terms of tone of voice, I think is what you might be referring to in terms of baby language. That's exactly what user testing is meant to uncover, is whether people find your tone of voice acceptable. And what we try to emphasize too is that, if you're taking an English work and you're translating into French, that the French version is tested with French users so that it makes sense to them, and that the tone of voice and the way it's communicated is also acceptable to the audience. So it's always a focus on the audience. We're always bringing it back to them to ensure that it is acceptable and clear to the audience. I hope that helps.
All right. Thank you, Iva and Laura. We have time for maybe one last question before we wrap up, as we are a little over our time. Jocelyn asks, what's the best way to learn how to apply these standards to my work? Apologies if this was already answered.
I can answer that. The best way, I think, is to focus on the audience and to work through that section, really lean into the definition of plain language and highlight things, look at the examples, see what applies to your own work, learn as much as you can about your audience. And I think that's where you will find your examples will help you so much. I would take it bit by bit and give us feedback.
All right. Thank you, Laura and Iva. At this point, I'd like to bring our presentation to a close. I'll just remind all of our attendees that you will receive within a couple of days from Editors Canada, you'll receive an email that has a link to a copy of the recording that will also take you to a copy of the slide deck, and the recording will include the questions and answers answered live by Laura and Iva. And with that, I'd like to thank very much everyone for attending. I'd like to thank our presenters on behalf of Editors Canada, Iva Cheung and Laura Edlund, for a very thorough and incredibly informative presentation. Thanks to all who attended and for your continuing support of the Editors Canada webinar program. And please, if you enjoyed this one, do respond to our evaluation form to let us know what you enjoyed, what you would like to see more of, and any other feedback you have for our webinar program. And so on behalf of Editors Canada, thank you, Iva and Laura. Thank you, our attendees, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks very much, Carol. Thank you to Editors Canada.